last meeting on Wednesday, I entered the period where fully modern humans appear on Earth. This is an early version either of Homo sapiens sapiens or an antecedent, which we would call Neanderthal man, or Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, which is a subspecific variation of Homo sapiens sapiens, now extinct. And this happened somewhere roughly at 100,000 years ago. Now you could say it happens 150,000 years ago, or it begins 90,000 years ago. 90,000 is wrong, it really happens before that, but I'm really focusing on the last 100,000 years. And I'm focusing on the last 100,000 years because that's when subspecific variation occurs, and we call that conventionally racial variation. When I say racial variation, I mean genetically based variation that used to be called races and now is called clines, because there's no such thing as an actual race. There is certainly such a thing as genetically based traits which are scattered and which can be found, but you can't find 10 of them that cluster in a statistically significant way, and we're going to call those people Scandinavian. That does not exist. But I don't want you to leave here supposing that there isn't genetically based human variation. I don't want you to think that it's useless and that it's just an evolutionary leftover. In some ways it's not. But I do want you, and third, to realize that it is cultural practices that control most of the racial variation, most of the genetically based variation that still exists among us, both keeping pathologies that people have under control so that they reproduce or don't die early, or keeping them in existence for customary reasons. Religious prescriptions that this group should only marry that group and blah, blah, blah. That's what I mean by religious prescriptions. But there are also ethnic prescriptions, and Africa is still filled with them. And the American Southwest, among Native Americans, we don't find Hopis and Navajos intermarrying because they hate each other. So that's the kind of easy thing to talk about. So I'm focusing now on the last 100,000 years, and I want to cover a bunch of things here. And this stuff is really well tied to the films, including the one you saw on Friday and the one you will see this coming Friday. Today what I'm going to deal with is what we call the Mousterian economy. And I started this the other day. Neanderthals made tools, had very sophisticated and complex culture, and that culture is called Mousterian. Spelled with a capital M, spelled that way, and it is the name derived from a site in southern France where Neanderthal stone tools were found. And so Mousterian is the difference between Neanderthal, which is this set of fossilized bones, and the stuff people left behind in the cave sites, or really the overhang sites and the field sites, open air sites that Neanderthals left. Now, when I started talking about the plasticity of rocks, on Wednesday, I was using what we know about Mousterian stone tools as a way of describing hunter-gatherer economy. That is one hell of a leap. And I'm going to do it anyway, to show you how we understand how people before agriculture used plants and animals that were wild. That's what I'm going to do today. I'll start it in a sec, but either at the end of today or Wednesday, I'm going to then move to something that is contemporary with this, and that is what you're all familiar with, Upper Paleolithic cave art. The paintings on the walls of underground caves done around 25,000 years ago. And I'll show you how to think about that. And you might sprint ahead, or maybe you've already read it. The stuff in your book, at least look at the pictures of what I will be talking about either late today or on Wednesday. Now, this period of 100,000 years ago, maybe it begins 150,000 years ago, ends 10,000 years ago. And this is tied up with the very last part of the Ice Ages, called the Pleistocene, actually called the later Pleistocene. And the later Pleistocene is the last million years, but not the last 10,000 years. The last million years are the glacial ages that you learned in high school geology. And these are the major ice ages that cover the northern hemisphere. And as you know, there are a series of undulations when the water on Earth is deposited as snow and ice, and these glaciers descend over North America. So the climate changes, the fauna and the flora that depend on particular climates change, and all of this last phase of human emergence happens under these conditions. However, what goes on at the close of the last part of the Pleistocene is that humans, who are now extraordinarily well equipped with our symbolic capacities, during this time and by 10,000 years, occupy all of the unoccupied areas of the Earth. So the New World is occupied, probably at 20,000 years ago, maybe at 25,000 years ago, maybe at 30,000 years ago. So we've got all these events in this last 100,000 years, except for the last 10,000 when we get to us. Okay, so that's the overview. Let me move to hunter-gatherer economies. The materials that I'm going to give you work the same whether we're looking at Australopithecus africanus, or whether, at 2.4, 2.5 million, or whether we look at Neanderthals, either progressive or classic, at 100,000. The first thing to keep in mind is what we call the hunting-gathering seasonal round. Which is sometimes called a territorial round. This stuff is now really fascinating. So far as anybody knows, in prehistoric archaeology, as long as humans, hominids, and maybe even Homo habilis had any form of communication, or used stone tools, or hunted, they would have hunted in a territorial round. And that's two things. It's a territory demarcated by seasonal availability of plants and animals, through which hominids or humans traveled at predictable times of the year to capture or exploit wild foods, plants and animals, when they were available during a particular season. I'll go through this. This is an extremely simple idea, but it is not an idea that you've been taught yet. I don't think it's particularly, it's not said in an interesting way in the book either. A seasonal round is two things. It is an area on Earth where there are plants and animals. And those plants and animals, like all plants and animals that have ever been, have times when they can be gathered or hunted. And then what humans, who are hunters and gatherers, do is they go out and they hunt, or they collect, or they pick, or they dig those plants and animals when they're available. This is before domestication. And keep in mind, domestication is really complex. But in domestication, you bring the food to you and you grow it. So instead of walking through what's seasonally available or available in the wild, what farmers do is they take and they make something a crop and they plant different things and different animals in the same, as it were, barnyard. So they don't move, they move the plants. That's part of the process of domestication. Hunters and gatherers walk, wander, but not the way you and I use wander. They travel systematically through a very large territory, normally very large, and they go to the same place to do the same things year after year after year in the same territory. We know this because until the early 20th century, and indeed until the 1950s, there were plenty of hunters and gatherers still around on Earth for anthropologists and missionaries and military scouts to write up. They're now all gone. In fact, during the early part of my own lifetime, the last became extinct. However, in the 19th century and in the 18th century, during the times that we call European exploration, there were plenty of hunters and gatherers, more or less intact, and missionaries described them, early anthropologists described them, military officers and scouts described them, people like Lewis and Clark described them. But one of the things we have now forgotten is that military men in Western Europe and in the United States were often taught how to describe the people they saw. That's now come back. So you can get anthropologists working with the military in Afghanistan, and they started this in Iraq, where people would go out and they would describe the ways, anthropologically, that people lived their lives. Well, there's a huge record of this for hunters and gatherers in Australia, in Siberia, and all over North and South America. Really good descriptions of how hunter-gatherer bands, and that's a technical term that I'll get to right now, actually worked. And one of the things that everybody saw was that hunter-gatherers run themselves on the basis of kinship. And kinship is who you're related to. You understand kinship because you have a mother, a father, you have siblings, you have grandparents, you have aunts and uncles, you have first cousins, which you probably can identify, and second cousins, which you probably cannot identify. And then you don't know what that first cousin or second cousin once or twice removed is. But if we depended on kinship, you would know. And furthermore, you'd see them fairly regularly. But you also, most of you would have godparents. Now those are relationships that are not based on blood, that is to say, genetics or marriage, or they're not based on affinal ties, which is what happens when you marry somebody and you have an in-law. Now, these are kin relationships, and their purpose is to give you a place. They're to allow you to ask them whatever you need to ask them. And kin relations, even in our own society, are not rational relations. They're what we call affective relationships. You can ask people for love, like you ask your mother for love.